Welcome to Business Insight. I'm Peter Marx. Our topic today is the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Report. My guest is Donna Kelley from Babson College. Donna, pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Tell me, what is the GEM report?
It's a study of entrepreneurs around the world. United States participates through Babson College, and we have in 2011, when this data was collected, we had 54 countries that collected data on the numbers of entrepreneurs in each of their countries or economies, what the profile of those entrepreneurs are, men, women, different age groups, income levels, and so forth, and also their aspirations to grow their company, to expand internationally, and to innovate.
And is there a particular purpose? Why? How many years has it been going on, and why did it get started to begin with?
We started the first survey in 1999, and the U.S. has participated every year. So this represents the 13th year that we've been going. And really the purpose was there wasn't a study that allowed us to compare entrepreneurs around the world with other economies to look at, how does the U.S. compare to some of the others in the developed economies like Western Europe, Japan, Singapore, Korea, and so forth. So we really wanted to try to understand who those entrepreneurs are, because they're really the lifeblood of these businesses that get started and are sustained, that create jobs and create innovations for their societies.
And what kind of trends did the GEM report find in this study?
Well, we had since 2008 seen a marked decline in entrepreneurship. In 2009, the entrepreneurship rate declined again in 2010. In 2011, on the other hand, we saw the rates jump up about 60%, equivalent to the level that we had in 2005. So we saw an increase in entrepreneurial activity, and this survey was done in the summer of 2011. We also saw more people starting to jump in because they saw opportunity rather than out of necessity because I have no other, sources of income.
And any differences you found among men and women entrepreneurs with the study?
Well, we have more proportionally, more women relative to men than the average around the world. The average around the world is about 6 women participate for every 10 men. Now that varies from countries like Pakistan and Iran, which have 10 to 20% of their entrepreneurs are women. But there are countries like Singapore, Thailand, Switzerland that have equal numbers of men and women. So the U.S. is about in between. We have about 8 women for every 10 men participating in this activity. Not as good as some of the other developed economies, but certainly above average.
Any difference in the way men and women are going about entrepreneurship?
Well, the women tend to be more necessity motivated. We also see a lot of differences in terms of their industry participation. Men have an equal balance more in the manufacturing, consumer-oriented sector, and business services, whereas we see much more participation in the consumer sector for women. And that could be a concern. I mean, one concern is that you would like to have women participating across all sectors, but also the consumer sector, for overemphasizing that tends to be more associated with lower growth businesses, with kind of smaller types of businesses, like direct to consumer activity, like might be a hairstylist, a restaurant, or retail sales.
The report talks about something called fear factor.
Yes.
Fear of failure factor.
Right.
What is that?
It's the extent that you would be constrained from starting a business because you were afraid of the risk of failure. So that could have a policy component. Maybe we would be concerned if people are responsible personally for their own bankruptcies or for their own companies closing. There also can be cultural stigmas associated with failure. We tend to see a lot of that in countries like Japan. In other countries, some of the Latin American communities, there is less concern about failure. I'd say the U.S., among the developed economies, has among the lowest fear of failure rates. And a lot of that is around that failure isn't seen as much a stigma, and sometimes the learning from failure can be really positive, leading eventually to some type of success.
Any difference among men and women with regard to this
Yeah,
fear of failure?
we see that women tend to have higher fear of failure rates. And men, especially in their youth and earlier careers, tend to be more willing to take risks, whereas women throughout most of their working career have maintain a fairly high fear of failure rate.
Certainly in business in general, it's become a smaller and smaller world, and we're seeing just everybody selling all over the place. What's happening with regard to entrepreneurship and for American entrepreneurs selling overseas?
We see a very low rate of international entrepreneurship. Countries that tend to participate in international sales are those that where you have more cross-cultural interactions, like in Western Europe. You go to Western Europe, people are more likely to speak 3 or 4 languages. Countries like Singapore have had a long history of international trade. But countries like the United States, they have a large population, a large diverse population. We also see the same in China and Brazil, that when you have countries with a large internal market, entrepreneurs tend to stick with those markets because they're familiar with them and because the logistics are easier to coordinate and they can be closer to their customers. I think there's a real policy component there, a real policy implication though, because if we don't start encouraging our entrepreneurs to be global thinkers, they will have to compete on the U.S. soil with global entrepreneurs from other countries.
How about on the educational side? Are there things that are being done or more could be done in order to help us?
Yes, certainly more can be done. What we emphasize at Babson College is more experiential learning and really training people to get in there, try something, because you can't always predict what will happen. You can't always predict that the market you thought you'd have would be the right market, or that the technology would work the way you think. So we encourage our students to start experimenting, to even fail. Fail and learn from it. And that will make a better product or service than if you followed that plan that you had from the beginning and didn't really listen to what was happening and that negative feedback.
How do economic conditions impact entrepreneurship?
Well, we tend to see we group the economies in 3 economic development levels. We have the emerging economies that are, for example, in the MENA, the countries of Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan African economies, some of the Southeast Asian economies. We call those the factor-driven, and they're really the early stage economies that are more reliant on extractive businesses. They don't really have industrialization happening at that point. They don't really have the infrastructure, political stability, or economic stability. There, we tend to see a very high rate of entrepreneurship, and it tends to be more necessity-based because those societies can't supply enough jobs, so people self-employ. Then when we get to the middle stage economies, and that includes the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China in South Africa, as well as much of Eastern Europe and Latin America, then we start seeing industrialization take hold. What happens is necessity-based reasons for jumping into entrepreneurship start to decline. Opportunity-based entrepreneurship starts to account for more of the reasons for getting into it. But we start to see a much lower rate of entrepreneurship because those in the earlier development stage that have to find jobs, that have to find a source of income, now have a choice that they can go in and work for somebody else. They can work as an employee. So we see declining entrepreneurship rate relative to economic development levels. And then when we get into the wealthier economies, necessity entrepreneurship continues to decline. We have more opportunity-based. Now, during a recession, we see that even in the developed economies, the entrepreneurship rate tends to go down, like we saw in the US during the recession, but proportionally more of those entrepreneurs are necessity-oriented. So really what we saw during this last recession is opportunity-based entrepreneurs were staying put. They weren't launching into their businesses. They were either waiting or opting out, staying with their current employment if they had it. So the economic downturn can really affect the entrepreneurship rate as well as the proportion of necessity entrepreneurship. But then when we saw the rate come up in 2011, we saw the opportunity entrepreneurs coming back in and pulling that rate up.
Well, certainly that's a good thing. Now maybe we're heading up, maybe we're about to take a dive.
Yeah.
Assuming that things don't go so well in the next year or so in the economy, what can be done to encourage the opportunity type of entrepreneurs?
The opportunity-based entrepreneurs?
Yeah.
Well, it's making them feel positive that their conditions in the environment are enabling them to start businesses. It's the access to finance that can be really important. The ability to recognize opportunities, to network. I think even when we talk about the global nature of entrepreneurship, to get people together from other countries and other backgrounds and really exchange ideas, because that's where truly novel concepts can increase and come up. Go ahead.
The GEM report, is there anything in particular that particularly surprised you in terms of the results?
I think this sort of youth dividend that I call it. We knew that younger people tended to enter entrepreneurship more so than the older populations. And it makes sense because when I'm younger, I have less to lose. I may not be as advanced in a job with a good, comfortable salary and a high position in my company. At the same time, I don't have the mortgages and kids in college. So that is not surprising. What was so surprising was the real distinct differences we saw between young men and young women. And we were assuming that there was a difference in men and women, and then that there was this youth bump, but not really connecting the two, that the difference between men and women happens really at those earlier ages. So I think it's concerning that young women are less likely to think they're capable, less likely to see that there are a lot of opportunities, having a greater fear of failure, and even having fewer associations with other entrepreneurs. That was, I think, one of the surprising parts of the report, and one that might have some implications, such as who do we see when we see entrepreneurs in the media? They're young men.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, there's an awful lot here that I think people could do a lot of research, and I know a lot of people are using it for research. But we're about out of time. I'd like to thank our guest, Donna Kelley from Babson College, for Business Insight. I'm Peter Marx. Thanks for joining us.